Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome on behalf of ASO and the Latin America Interest Group to this panel on the promise of multilateralism in Latin America. My name is Cesar Coronel Ortega. I am with the law firm of Coronel y Perez in Ecuador, and we have a great group of distinguished panelists for this session today. I'll say a bit more about the background of each right before their presentations. First, a quick housekeeping point. The Latin America Interest Group business meeting will take place later this summer. If you would like to attend, please ensure that you're signed up as a member of the Latin America Interest Group on the ASO website so that you get our notification. And also, as you know, we're taking questions during the panel. Please just be sure to type them in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. The chat box is for you all to communicate with each other. But if you have a question for the presenters, please type them on the Q&A box. Now, well, as the title of the session indicates, we'll be exploring the future of multilateralism in Latin America. And of course, this inevitably leads us to look at its record, in particular its recent record. And criticisms of multilateralism abound in the region, from recurrent debates about the OAS's and other institutions' effectiveness or ineffectiveness in promoting democratic governance and human rights, to the alleged failure of the Andean community or Mercosur and other similar organizations to promote true integration and/or economic development, or the difficulties in multilateral approaches to addressing crises such as those in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Haiti. So our panelists today will help us dig deeper into these questions, including some fundamental issues like what is the essence of multilateralism and the best way to evaluate its success. So our first speaker, Karen Alter from Northwestern University School of Law, and will help us place the discussion in historical and global context. We'll speak a bit about definitions and terminology, and we'll make some suggestions as to how to go about evaluating the success or failure of multilateralism. Then Marianna Durni, who's a professor at the Catholic University of Chile and was formerly with the Chilean Ministry of Foreign Affairs, will give the perspective of a Latin American Foreign Service officer on the current crisis or perceived crisis of multilateralism in the region, and will identify some of the forces at work behind it and the trajectory that multilateralism is likely to follow. So for example, whether there is more promise in ad hoc collaboration, as in the Lima Group, or than in formal institutions. Then Jorge Camine, who's a partner at Wilkie Farr & Gallagher, will focus on the record and future of multilateralism with respect to economic development and integration. And finally, Michael Camilleri from the Inter-American Dialogue will focus on the record and future of multilateralism in the areas of human rights and democratic governance. We'll spend the first half hour or so of the session in each of the presentations, which will be about 5-7 minutes, and then we'll leave the second half of the session for discussions and your questions. So before proceeding with our first speaker, let me make a preliminary point. Just note that multilateralism can have different meanings. Karen will explain John Ruggie's definition of multilateralism as an institutional form which coordinates relations among 3 or more states on the basis of generalist principles of conduct. But oftentimes, the word multilateralism is used to convey a different meaning. It may be used to refer to multilateral institutions or to what would be more appropriately referred to as a coalition of the willing. So you'll hear the word used with some of these different meanings in the course of this session, and that's to a certain point inevitable. But we should all be aware of the different senses in which the word is used, because obviously, depending on what exactly we are talking about, our predictions about its future success or failure can change quite significantly. So without further ado, let's proceed with the presentations, and let me introduce our first speaker, who is Karen Alter, known to many of you. She's a professor of international relations and international law at Northwestern University, and a permanent visiting faculty member at I-Court's Center of Excellence in the Faculty of Law at the University of Copenhagen. She has studied regional integration movements in Europe, Africa, and Latin America. And in particular, with respect to this panel, Karen's relevant books are The New Terrain of International Law, which again, many of you might know, as it won the ASO Certificate for Merit for a Preeminent Contribution to Creative Scholarship, and the book that she co-authored with Lawrence Helfer on Transplanting International Courts, the Law and Politics of the Andean Tribunal of Justice. which has actually been translated to Spanish and will soon be available in Spanish from a Colombian academic. You might also be familiar with Karen's recent Agile article, The Empire of International Law, which reviewed 3 books and actually focused on international law in Latin America. And her current research is investigating the turn to multilateralism after World War II, trying to understand how the shift from empire to multilateralism influenced international relations, and in specific, the construction of global economic rules. She's also one of the creators of a Rising Scholarship on International Regime Complexity, which is something that we will get to talk about at some point during our session. So without further ado, Karen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here. And as Cesar said, I'm going to start with Ruggie's definition. If we're talking about the future of multilateralism, then you really want to know the future of what? What are we talking about? And I'm going to give a kind of scholarly perspective, which is to turn to John Ruggie, who's a scholar of international relations, but also a practitioner. He's kind of the author of the social corporate responsibility idea. So this is an idea that he both academically created and lived. When we think about what multilateralism is in international relations, and I think this is a pretty widely accepted definition, it's an institutional form which coordinates relations among 3 or more states on the basis of generalized principles of conduct. Hopefully you can see the slide. That is, principles which specify appropriate conduct for a class of actions without regard to the particular interests of the parties or the strategic exigencies that may exist in a specific occurrence. So I want to underscore what I put in red, an institutional form, meaning it's a way of doing international relations. And it's not just based on numbers. So I didn't highlight 3 or more states, but the common usage of multilateral is whenever you have 3 or more states. But what Ruggie was emphasizing was the basis of generalized principles of conduct, which is the whole door opening to international law. You have these generalized principles that are part of the agreement, and that is supposed to be how you're doing business. And so this is a way of doing international relations. And if you think about what the promise of multilateralism is, to me, it means then what are we going to do if we don't use multilateralism? So what are the alternatives? And if we look back in time, the way that international relations have been structured, well, there have been empires where the center told you what to do. There have been networks of cities that actually hasn't, in city-states it existed, but certain people talk today whether the future of cities are going to be making arrangements of governments are completely dysfunctional. Maybe it'll be agreements of cities. There's the idea of hegemony, the hegemonic powers, whether it's the US and China, or in the past, maybe Europe and the US, get to set the terms of the rules. Or spheres of influence within your own region, you get to set the rules if you're the hegemonic power. Or a coalition of the willing. I think when you're talking about multilateralism as just any group of states, and there's no general principles, then to me, you're talking about a coalition of the willing. And then you have to say, well, if we don't have any formal institutions and rules, well, then we're just back to the balance of power and maybe mercantilism. So to me, the question is then, what is the way in which you're going to be doing business in the future? When we take this question to the context of Latin America in particular, because I've been studying multilateralism in many different contexts, let me just make two or three quick observations. First of all, Africa and Asia dealt with colonialism for a lot longer than Latin America. So the early versions of multilateral global institutions, especially the League of Nations and its mandate system, that wasn't really part of Latin America's history or story. They had actually a more positive relationship with the League of Nations than any of the mandate countries did. And so they've been pursuing multilateralism for a lot longer of a time, with Pan-Americanism already in the 1800s. And so it's kind of a different situation than it would be in Africa or in Asia. But the other difference is that in Latin America, it's always had kind of a counter-hegemonic basis to it. In the early days, it was to kind of push back against European powers and maybe later American powers. And more recently, like in the last 50 years, it's been as a way to unite to counter American influence. The second kind of difference is that Latin American countries tend to be presidentialist systems, which allows the executive to really shape policy very decisively. And so you've seen the fortunes and the goals of multilateralism really shift when the person in power shifts. I'll leave any conversation about effectiveness for later, but hopefully that gives us a basis to be thinking about the future of multilateralism.
Thank you very much, Karen. Our next speaker is Marianna Durni, who is a professor of public international law at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, where she also teaches specialized courses. She also teaches specialized courses at the Heidelberg Center for Latin America and in the Diplomatic Academy of Chile. With respect to this panel, Marianna, in addition to her extensive experience at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has written on topics such as the denunciation of the Exit Convention by Latin American countries. At the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Marianna has occupied different high-level positions. She was legal advisor for the last 3 cases that Chile had before the International Court of Justice, and was general coordinator of the legal team in one of them. She was also director for boundaries at the National Department of State Borders and Boundaries, being the first woman to serve in that post. And her last appointment was as Director General for Legal Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So, Marianna, the floor is yours.
I think you're muted, Marianna.
Yes. Well, I was saying that I'm pleased to be here with you, and I will immediately take Karen questions about the goal of multilateralism institutions as a starting point to analyze if the promise of multilateralism in Latin America has been honored, if the current crisis is related to those goals or the lack of them, and if we can still count on the promise of multilateralism for the future. In my analysis, Jorge's definition will also be a stake with the keywords of institutional reform, coordination, generalized principles. Thus, objectives and principles are at the center of this debate. I will argue that the objectives and ultimately goals of multilateralism in Latin America have been lost sight of in the debate, and the factors of political ideology are taking precedence over them. This ends up clashing institutionalization and a rule-based order, which are the essence of successful multilateralism. As a response, new initiatives appear. The underlying reasons for the offensive against the multilateral system in Latin America are like the ones claimed by the international community. So I won't go there now. But if something is particular about Latin America is how ideological difference or affinities were gaining control over the impulse of multilateralism to an extent in which goals and principles were completely overshadowed by political forces, national interests, and agendas of governments in office. Cycles of pendular movements between liberal and nationalist views paved the way to our current scenario. Multilateralism emerged as a counter-hegemonic strategy, and that was its first promise. It was very robust, with strong commitment from countries, both towards the international system as well as within the region. Several structures and normative regimes were created to address different issues, which led to an inorganic, dispersed system with a proliferation of instances and objectives, often overlapping. It would be naive, of course, to think that political ideologies did not influence the myriad of multilateral instances. However, when goals and principles were more precise, or at least at the center of the driving forces, institutions could survive periods of crisis. That happened with economic trade integration initiatives and with the establishment of the human rights regional system. Concerning broader integration and cooperation mechanisms, Latin American multilateralism proved to be more vulnerable to ideological harmony and political agreement as a key to achievement. What is the situation today? For the sake of time, I cannot mention all the institutions in detail of the current state, but let's say that emblematic projects are dismantled or paralyzed, like ALBA, CAN, and UNASUR. Formerly more robust organisms, such CELAC and Mercosur, are also in a standby period. Even the US, the paradigm of regional organization, and with a solid structures and a set of rules, is being heavily criticize. Each instance has its own internal and structural problems. Still, all were hindered by political polarization and confrontation. As a result, all have struggled to respond to their specific challenges. Some initiatives have been able to resist. The Pacific Alliance enjoys more vigorous health, as well as the fora under Hitler. Not only the predominance of the political factor placed against this complex system, the traditional multilateral schemes, at least in Latin America, have not been able to face the most pressing problems of the country, which have led to explosions of social crises in the region. Issues of migration, climate change, public health are lacking collective action. And here we are again in need of having defined and well-organized goals, in other words, more content than forms. Finally, this backlash against regionalism had a direct impact in two intervening features: institutionalization and legal framework, or the development of international law. They are related to the very concept of multilateralism as described already. Institutionalization has two aspects. First, existing institutions are paralyzed, dismantled, losing influence. Second, as a consequence, states are preferring new dynamics of engagement without institutions and formalities in ad hoc group conformations. The Lima Group, the recently created Proxur, and other initiatives with other extra-regional actors, even like the Alliance for Multilateralism, are examples. When it comes to international law, the aim of achieving a common normative structure is not present in the new scenario. On the contrary, states are trying to avoid building commitments. While these informal and unregulated approaches are not per se negative or unproductive, they evidence undoubtedly a change in the way of tackling common problems. Fresh and dynamic perspectives could indeed prove more flexibility and more efficient decision-making processes with specific projects and policy outcomes. But the key challenge is that they must demonstrate if they have a vocation of lasting over time, beyond the temporal ideological affinity of the governments or the will of the leaders who promote them. What promise do they represent? Are they long-term programs, or will they disappear with the next political change? That will depend on the real goals that are pursuing. And going back to religious again, if they're based on shared principles and have the purpose of establishing a rule-based order. Those and other collective initiatives, future success, must renew the promise of multilateralism and must be shielded against a particular political agenda.
Thank you very much, Marianna, for that great presentation. Our next presenter is Jorge Camine, who is a partner in the Corporate and Financial Services Department of Wilkie Farr & Gallagher and a member of the Latin American Practice Group. Jorge has spent over 20 years in private practice, focusing on advising clients in a wide range of transactions in the energy and infrastructure sector globally, with a particular emphasis on structuring and financing of energy and infrastructure projects in the US and Latin America. This has included significant experience working with multilateral development banks. In addition, Jorge previously served in the legal department at the World Bank and has been involved in various pro bono matters involving international development. And as I said, he will tell us about the future prospects of multilateralism and the record of multilateralism with respect to integration and economic development. So Jorge, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cesar, and thanks for the introduction and also for the context that Karen and Mariana gave us. So as Cesar said, my focus, and I have to admit my particular bias, although I had a wonderful experience of 2 years at the World Bank focusing on the role of public institutions, the bulk of my experience has really been in looking at private investment in energy and infrastructure, so at the intersection of public and private institutions and organizations, and a lot of time spent in Latin America. So as I think about this question, while I think about it in terms of my practical experience, I also think about it as a Latin American and as someone who's worked in the region. And I tend to focus on the economic relations and economic development aspects of multilateralism. And I think there, and I'll come back to Professor Ruggi's definition and also some of the points that Karen and Marianna raised. But I'd like to say that I think the message that I have is that we actually have notable and successful examples of multilateralism in Latin America. And I think, maybe not surprisingly, of the specific institutions to which I belong and with whom I work with, be it the Inter-American Development Bank, some of the smaller regional banks like CABE and CAF, and the participation, which really is uniform, of most of the countries in the region in organizations like the World Bank and some of its associated institutions. So I think in that sense, we have success. And why do we have success? Because I think if we think about Ruggi's definition, you certainly have more than 3 organizations or 3 countries, excuse me, who are participating, and they have signed up to a set of principles. Those principles start with the charters of those institutions. So here, looking a bit towards the last, say, 60 years, when we talk about success in economic relational integration, and we see that while there may have been shifts in the leverage or role that specific countries had and their ability that some of my panelists might say is somewhat hegemonic at times, I would argue they have still all continued to collaborate regardless of which president or administration is in power. And they have, while they've evolved in their focus and they've evolved to include new principles and new considerations such as environmental, social, and governance considerations, they really have continued as institutions to grow, and their members, who we should remember, one of the unique aspects of those institutions is that the members or a portion of the members are also the recipients of the support that comes from those institutions. So there is a symbiotic relationship there between membership and recipients, and hence some alignment of interest. So, as I said, I think that I would look to those institutions as an example of success. Now, I think if we were to take a step back, because not everything when it comes to economic relations and integration could be described as a success of the promise of multilateralism. If we describe that promise as being integration, because we believe integration is beneficial, I think I would draw an important distinction. Where I think we've seen success, I would generally describe success has been where those institutions, and again, as I mentioned, multilateral development banks, really have been focused on resource pooling. And what I mean by resource pooling is those instances where the countries have been able to come together and combine both their contributions and their resources and leverage them towards a greater impact, particularly in terms of economic development. And I think there, as I mentioned, I would include among those multilateral institutions that have been successful, as I said, the IDB, CABE, and CAF. And what have they been able to provide? What has been the product of that multilateralism? It has been the ability to catalyze financing to public and private sectors, provide invaluable technical assistance, train staff many times who go back to the countries from which they came to help to build capacity and provide leadership in those thought leadership in those countries, and often to coordinate regional efforts, touching on something that both Karen and Marianna mentioned. As I found myself in my experience, these institutions are able to many times overcome collective action problems or specific national interests in order to be able to bring to us some measure of coordination around issues such as climate change, as well as some of the issues we're seeing now with COVID. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention that. I think the current crisis is underscoring the fact that these institutions have been instrumental in helping countries cope with the crisis in a way they might have been encountered difficulties doing independently. whether it's the IMF providing emergency funding or the World Bank or the IDB providing not only funding to the public sector, but also to the private sector, as we're starting to see in the case of Chile with the distribution companies and the credit facility that the IDB has committed to providing, or it's to individual companies like AES El Salvador, which is expecting to also receive credit from the private arm of the IDB. So that's a success, but not everything has been a success. Where have we seen challenges, and where do I think we have to focus in terms of seeking to use multilateralism to make the pie bigger and to increase success? And I think that's where there have been efforts towards market and economic integration. That's where we've seen that it's at times been difficult, perhaps because it's required changes that some may view international interest as increasing competition and causing economic impacts on incumbent national industries and companies. At times, it can also be as a matter of political economy because there's a perception of loss of sovereignty or loss of control over what are viewed as strategic sectors, such as energy. And at times, it can be, as we saw in the reaction following the 90s, a sense that particular policies that were adopted in the interest of economic integration have had effects that people associate as being negative. And so I think there where we see market and economic integration, there we've seen some challenges. And I might mention a few examples. Some, I'm not a trade lawyer, so I would be remiss in delving into it, but I think we all recall that in the 90s, there was a sense that there would be trade integration, the free trade agreement of the Americas. And of course, that proved challenging. And in fact, we fell back to bilateralism, as Marianna was mentioning. I'm much closer to efforts such as ISIAPAC, the integration in Central America of the electricity grid. The physical infrastructure was integrated. And there I would argue it's a pooling of resources that was successful. Where there have been challenges, and we've touched on some of the issues I just mentioned, is where legal and regulatory changes were needed. Restructuring of the electricity sectors in individual countries in Central America, that's where, or challenges to incumbents, that's where we've seen some opposition. And that's where the integration and this promise of multilateralism has proven to be more difficult. I'd leave you with one last example, which I think is perhaps in between, and I think a positive development. We talked about the Alianza del Pacífico, the Pacific Alliance, and there early on in what was, we can discuss on the panel, perhaps not as formal an institution, an effort of multilateralism as, say, the Inter-American Development Bank, we nevertheless saw an integration of the stock markets, the Mercado Integrado Latinoamericano, MILA, which actually was integrated among the 4 countries that are the members of the Pacific Alliance. And there again, there's pooling of resources towards the greater good. However, we've seen kind of, again, the other side, which is a challenge in terms of harmonization of tax laws. So I think on the balance, I would say on the economic relations front, I think we should focus on the successes. There's work to be done, but I think there's some good examples for where the promise of multilateralism can actually achieve great objectives. I think, Cesar, back to you.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Very interesting, to a certain extent, counterpoint to some of the other points made earlier. Sure, lots of discussion on this will follow. Now let's go on to our final speaker before we start with the discussion and some questions from the audience. Our final speaker is Michael Camilleri, who is currently the director of the Peter D. Bell Rule of Law Program at the Inter-American Dialogue think tank. He served in the Obama administration from 2012 to 2017 as the Western Hemisphere advisor on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff and as director for Andean Affairs at the National Security Council. Prior to joining the US government, Michael was a human rights specialist at the OAS, Organization of American States, and a senior staff attorney at the Center for Justice and International Law. Michael is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he has been an adjunct professor of law and international affairs at George Washington University, American University, and the University of Baltimore. He holds a BA in history from the University of Notre Dame and a JD from Harvard Law School. So, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cesar. So great to be with you. Thank ASIL as well for the invitation, and look forward to the discussion to come. I will try to keep us maybe on a slightly more positive track and just compliment the very thought-provoking presentations of my co-panelists. I think, while Mariana is undoubtedly right that Latin American multilateralism is currently fragmented and paralyzed in many respects, in the area of democracy and human rights, things look a little better, as I think Jorge laid out in the economic relations sphere. So let me just offer a few thoughts to try to support that premise, and then maybe identify some of the challenges that I do see in this area. So specifically in the context of the Organization of American States, I think you see in the area of democratic governance and human rights many of the elements of Ruggi's definition. You see institutional forms of state cooperation based on principles that specify appropriate conduct, and you see states operating in ways that perhaps do not disregard their narrow national interests and strategic exigencies, but are not entirely driven by them. And so what this looks like at the OAS, after many decades of kind of trial and error and building, is a strong legal framework comprised of the Inter-American Democratic Charter and human rights treaties, and a solid institutional infrastructure. Certainly in the area of human rights, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, electoral observation missions, notwithstanding some recent controversy in Bolivia in particular, and to maybe a lesser extent on corruption with MISESIC and the former MASI mission in Honduras. So I would argue, and obviously there's not time to really get into this, but I would argue that this has produced tangible results over the course of decades in consolidating democracy and human rights in the region. We can look at rolling back the vestiges of authoritarian regimes, such as censorship laws and amnesty laws. We can look at the expansion and the protection of the rights of women and ethnic and sexual minorities. Or you can look at the preventive diplomacy under the Inter-American Democratic Charter to head off political crises in a number of countries in the last decade and a half. These achievements, I think, stand in marked contrast to the sort of ad hocism of the fly-by-night multilateral adventures that have cropped up in Latin America, again, over the last couple of decades. So notwithstanding this progress, of course, I do see a number of challenges to inter-American multilateralism in the area of democracy and human rights, and I'll just quickly mention three to hopefully contribute to the discussion. The first, I think, is political. The 2001 consensus that produced the Inter-American Democratic Charter is largely gone. That consensus would be impossible today, and based on the both kind of hardened authoritarians in the region as well as the softer kind of authoritarian populists. One consequence of this, I think, is the emergence of what we've called coalitions of the willing, such as the Lima Group, to kind of fill the gap where that democratic consensus is lacking for more meaningful action at the OAS. A second challenge is institutional. So despite the fairly robust normative and institutional structure that I mentioned, there does remain, I think, a crucial lack of institutionality, specifically with respect to implementation of the Democratic Charter. We've seen this particularly in the case of Venezuela, where the lack of institutionality leaves enforcement of the Charter largely to the discretion of the Secretary General, who is a naturally political actor. And so what you see is a real contrast in the approach, for example, of the last two Secretary Generals. And that's not a recipe, in my view, for consistent and effective enforcement of democratic norms. And it's one explanation, I think, for democratic backsliding in the region. And then a final challenge, and I'll close with this, is geopolitical. And I think there is no question that the underlying tension over the role of the U.S. in the Americas and the countervailing ambitions of other actors represents a structural weakness for the OAS that limits its effectiveness and its strength. I do think U.S. hegemony at the OAS is overstated as a practical matter. As a former US diplomat, I can tell you that I often wished the OAS operated as the US Ministry of Colonies, but in practice, that is very far from being the case, and wrangling those votes was often quite challenging. But nonetheless, I do think that this practical, the practical reality is that the counter-hegemonic impulse that Karen and Marianna spoke to, and the appeal of that counter-hegemonic impulse has led to many of the recent Latin American kind of multilateral projects that have been mentioned, the CELACs, the UNASURs, the ALBAs, and so on. Now, these projects have largely failed, as Marianna mentioned. I happen to think that's a good thing for the most part, but they have at various points kind of threatened to undermine or weaken the inter-American system, including and perhaps especially in the area of democracy and human rights. And so I think in that regard, the deeper historical and geopolitical dynamics that Karen and Marianna mentioned are likely to continue posing a challenge to the promise of multilateralism, especially in protecting human rights and democracy in our hemisphere. So I'll close there, Cesar. Thanks, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Michael. Well, so that completes the first part of our session with the initial presentations. And now we have 25 minutes for discussion and some questions from the audience. And we have already a few on some of the topics that we've touched on. But let's go back to some of the start maybe by discussing some of the fundamental questions that Karen got into. And Karen, can you sort of share some thoughts as to how you think we should evaluate the success of multilateralism generally? I mean, how should we think about success or effectiveness? Because that's an important point, and the answer might not be obvious.
Thanks. So this brings up a point that I forgot to mention, which is that I don't think you can get overly formalist and look at like the founding charter and at the goals, because I think at its bottom, the goals of the regional economic systems, which are the ones that I know the best, was always to promote development. I think the goals for the human rights system is to promote human rights. And so you don't want to be overly formalist about whether or not they achieved the goals that are written down on paper, because the strategy that is best to promote development might actually change. And what you see in Africa is that at least the courts have decided that they're probably more able to promote human rights than they are to promote economic integration. And that's where they focus their attention. So I think you have to look at what they actually try to do, not what they wrote on a piece of paper 50 years ago. And what they actually try to do are what governments commit to and where they put their money where their mouth is. And then you would assess effectiveness based on how well they succeed in the objectives that they have, that the leaders have defined for themselves. I have to say that I sometimes really wonder, even on that term, if that's what they really want. I mean, UNASUR, which I never honestly took very seriously as an integrationist effort. I think it was an effort to say, look, we're going to do more and better. And so we're going to create a common passport, and we're going to create free movement of people. And I had to say, seriously, like, you really want free movement of people? Because, I mean, the European Union is the only place that has achieved free movement of people, and it's a pretty complicated issue. And one might say it's why Britain left. So I don't take at face value that everything that they say they want to achieve. But for the things they really put their money into and they really make an effort towards, that I think you can assess whether or not they've made some positive movement in the direction that they intended to go. So we think about not total compliance with every rule, because rules can be made really shallow where you don't have to actually do anything, or they can be made really ambitious and deep, and you might not get all the way there. What we have to do for global climate change is huge, and we want ambitious rules, and we might not get totally there, but it's better than saying the rule is everyone keep polluting, then of course there's full compliance. So where they put their effort, where they really try, that you should assess.
I don't know if any of the co-panelists have some comments on that before I say anything. Well, so where does that leave I guess, Karen, come back to you with the questions. Where does that leave the stated goals? I mean, they certainly matter, and it seems like, if we take Ruggi's definition of multilateralism, which emphasizes principles and rules, I mean, they certainly must matter or have a great importance, but perhaps not for evaluating effectiveness or the goals.
Well, I think what Ruggi is saying when he says principles, he's saying a rules-based system. Okay, so if everyone is simply ignoring the rules, then yeah, that would be a problem for whether or not the regime is functioning according to principles, or according, if it's a legal system, according to a rule of law. But I would say that there's just a lot of junk law out there. So like if you look at a treaty, it has all kinds of articles, and some of the articles move forward robustly and others just kind of sit there as maybe aspirational, but if there's no effort to actually bring them to life, then you have to kind of wonder. The Andean community in the last years perhaps is an effort to counteract Correa's assault on the Andean community, actually eliminated its goal of a common external tariff. And I have to say, in all my years at looking at these regional integration systems, I've never seen them go backwards. I've never seen them say, you know what, this was an objective that we cannot achieve, and I don't even know if we want to achieve, but we don't have the political will to achieve this. And so they eliminated the common external tariff as a community goal. Like I said, that was a first. But so I think you want it to stand by its principles and have a rules-based system. But whether it accomplishes every single rule or not, I guess not breaking the rules matters to me more than the fact that you've accomplished every rule.
I see. And so I guess that would, I would tie that into a question that I had for Marianna. She was talking about some of the ad hoc initiatives, giving some examples, and both the recent ad hoc initiatives like the Lima Group or the Rio Group, and efforts at creating sort of alternative structures such as UNASUR, were those a result of the rules of the existing institutions being too inflexible? Were those a result of those institutions being in a certain way too inflexible? And to put it another way, I mean, to what extent do those initiatives really represent a crisis of the pre-existing multilateralism, or do they represent more a rebellion against that multilateralism? I think you're still muted, Marianne.
Yeah, that is a good question, something to really study about it. But well, I think that these groups that are new initiatives that were created as a response to others that failed, probably I will back to the same concept. Of course, there is an institutional problem, structures that didn't work, some kind of rigid procedures, and but what really attacked the core of all those initiatives is the lack of consensus on how to react, how to deal with regional problems, and that lack of consensus comes from a political view. So it's really difficult to make some kind of a predicament if that institution will eventually work in a more or in a less polarized scenario. So that's what Michael was saying. That's the same risk that the new institutions are taking, because they are also running against this kind of a political atmosphere that at the end it permeates all good intentions, all reasonable goals, or flexible structures. So it could be the case that this is this kind of a new initiatives have more flexibility and a more modern view of how to deal with problems, and precisely try to avoid that stick structures that former institutions had. But the risk of that is that that at the same time, when you do not put the institutions in front of above the national interests or the national the specific problems that you're tackling, probably your institution will end as soon as the problems are dealing in another way, and or the political forces changes. So I think the thing is that that it's what is worried is this proliferation of dead bodies all over, because we have a few that are not really terminated, like legally terminated, but we have it there, and sometimes the new institution have the same purposes. So what was, I think that we must do the reflection of what was the thing that really failed institutionally in the previous institution before going crazy creating new institutions. You know, it's probably they will need a reshape, a new fashion, a new perspective, new rules, and probably more flexibility, of course, that take into account the national interest. That is the thing that is at stake. But I think that we should make a real profound study and reflection of what have we done and what we want to do for the future.
Do any of the co-panelists have anything to comment on that point?
I might add that Latin America has a tendency to create all kinds of new institutions. They had this idea of open regionalism in the past, and I think the original term, the spaghetti bowl, was coined with respect to Latin America, because they're constantly creating new institutions. And of the regional economic agreements that I studied, it really was this kind of counter-hegemonic narrative. So you had the Andean community, which had gone in a rather free trade-oriented direction. You had Mercosur, which, as I saw it, was Brazil trying to create a space to counter NAFTA. If NAFTA started getting too big and meaningful or wanting to grow, then Mercosur would be a counter of that. And then you had Venezuela, who wanted to leave the Andean community and join Mercosur so that he could have maybe a more leftist-oriented regime. But then Brazil didn't have a lot of interest in that. So then Venezuela said, well, let me create ALBA, and that'll be even more leftist. And so they would just create new institutions to go in the direction that the political leader wanted. Then Correa creates UNASUR, which is going to now unite Mercosur and the Andean community and really just kind of kill off the Andean community. And so you end up with all of these institutions which they abandon because they cannot make it bend to their will. The country in power can't make it bend to their will. And so I think it's right. Mariana's right that you want to assess what happened and what didn't happen. But I don't know if the political leaders who keep creating these agreements or walking away from them have that interest. I don't know if it plays into their political interest.
Right. I mean, it would seem that there are those rules there in place, and so multilateralism could be said to be working, well to a certain extent. It's just that they're kind of, they want to bend precisely those rules and those principles.
I was going to say, so I said, I feel like it, and we had this discussion in preparing for the panel. It's a bit subjective, right? It's in the eye of the beholder, and it's the challenge maybe of defining what the promise of multilateralism is. I just want to mention, I think most people know this, but there's an argument that the Pacific Alliance, to sort of add to this discussion, was a counterweight to Brazil's economic power to try to unite those economies. And I think, from my perspective, I think it had some success outside of the Ruggie definition, but in terms of trying to establish that coordination.
Mm-hmm. So there's actually a question from the audience, or a couple of questions from the audience points about the role of the U.S. In all of this, and we had actually amongst ourselves talked about a little bit. So I guess there's 3 points, I guess. To what extent are some of the multilateral institutions that exist really hegemonic or not? I mean, the IADB was normally thought of as a place that really was taking multilateralism seriously up until there's been some recent controversy on the appointment of the new president. But to what extent, are institutions like the multilaterals, the multilateral banks, instruments of hegemony? 2, how do the policies of the Trump administration affect, or how have they affected sort of the prospects for multilateralism in the region? And a third question about the role of the U.S. would be, what does the future hold? And particularly if Joe Biden wins the U.S. presidency, will that have a significant effect on the role of the U.S. in multilateralism in the region? Because you could say that the U.S. has retreated somewhat from a sort of leadership role in the region, leaving space for actors such as China. So I don't know, Michael, maybe you can start by giving us some perspective on those points.
Sure, happy to. So look, I think there's no secret that the Trump administration has been deeply ambivalent about multilateralism, has in many cases undermined actively, not just U.S. alliances, but multilateral institutions, whether the U.S. is part of them or not. I mean, the sanctions slapped on the ICC are maybe a kind of an extreme example of this. But you could hardly draw a starker kind of contrast between the policies of this administration and what would likely be the international engagement from a Biden administration. I guess within the Americas, the one caveat would be that the Trump administration has sort of found a relationship of convenience on at least some issues with the OAS and specifically with Secretary General Almagro, especially on the issue of Venezuela. So I don't know that you could argue the Trump administration has strengthened the OAS, but it has collaborated at least kind of opportunistically with the OAS on certain issues where interests and policies aligned. In terms of what we can expect from a Biden administration, I mean, I think there's 3 things maybe that are very clear in everything that Vice President Biden has kind of said and written recently. The first is that he sees diplomacy as kind of the primary instrument of U.S. power. The second is that he places, again, a lot of importance on restoring U.S. alliances, and NATO is maybe most prominent here. And the third is that he clearly sees some global challenges, and climate change is probably the most prominent, as uniquely and sort of exclusively capable of being addressed only in a multilateral kind of framework. And he sees the U.S. as needing to kind of occupy the kind of lead role in those multilateral institutions. So I think it's quite clear that the disposition of a Biden administration would be towards deepening multilateral cooperation, both regionally and globally, and trying to restore U.S. leadership in those spaces. I think with the Summit of the Americas coming to the U.S. in 2021, he would have a unique opportunity to sort of convey that leadership and that vision within this hemisphere. The challenge, of course, is that the world looks very different than it did 4 years ago. I mean, the rules-based international order was already fraying 4 years ago. And now, after 4 years of abdication by President Trump, you have not just strain, but I think a real kind of crisis of the order, to the point where scholars like Graham Allison are calling for just abandoning the U.S.-based or U.S.-led international order completely, and conceding that the future is one of spheres of influence. So I think we can safely assume that a Biden administration will have a strong multilateral orientation, but executing on that vision will be very challenging.
Right. Thank you, Michael.
Can I jump
Sure. Yeah. I was going to say yes. Just keep in mind we have just over 5 minutes left, and it'd be good to address one of the other questions from the audience.
So the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has been tracking American public opinion on international issues for a very long time. And what they found under the Trump administration is what you would not expect. They found the greatest growth and bump in favor of multilateralism than they have seen in years. It's almost like everything that Donald Trump tries to put forward as American policy, public opinion, then repudiates in its level of support. So absolutely, we've seen the United States under Donald Trump, but even in other ways, walk away from a rules-based system. It started before then, to be sure. But in terms of promoting U.S. values or making U.S. values an element of American foreign policy, there's widespread, deep support for that. In terms of working through multilateral institutions and alliances, deep, deep American support for that. So when there's a political leader who has the backing, I mean, it's not like American opinions have changed. Americans have always been greatly supportive of multilateralism, and I think we'll get that back again.
Thank you, Karen. Jorge, I think you wanted to say something about the multilaterals and the IDB. Multilateral banks, I should say.
I was going to say, no, and I think that's an important distinction because I would certainly distinguish the OAS or the UN that are more political institutions where, you know, in a sense, it's sort of one country, one vote from the multilateral development banks, which were designed with capital contributions giving weighted voting, as is the case with the IDB and the World Bank. So, nevertheless, I would underscore, and again, touching a little bit on Ruggie and what we've been talking about, it's one thing to have a weighted vote, which may allow you to block decisions to an extent. You can't unilaterally, but it makes it more difficult to pass things that you don't agree with. You can kind of push an agenda. You can use soft power. But I think certainly at this juncture, setting aside the current controversy around the appointment of the next president of the IDB, if we looked at the test, you know, could the Trump administration say, we demand that IDB provide funding to X or Y U.S. company that wants to do something? There are rules, and there you would have to work through them. And I think something as forceful as and direct as that would meet with institutional resistance and resistance from the other members. So again, I mean, there are rules, there are procedures. If anything, I think sometimes the criticism leveled against the multilateral development banks is that they don't move as quickly as some people would like to address issues and evolve. And that's because they have these rules and you have to work through them, and changes have to be agreed by, you know, to some degree by consensus. So in that sense, I think I would differ with, to the extent the question suggested that these institutions are hegemonic vehicles for the United States or really any other power. One last point, I mean, which I think we haven't focused on as much recently, but certainly in my time in those institutions, and I think this is kind of coming up a little bit in the context of the COVID crisis, let's remember that the U.S. is not the only member of those institutions that is also seeking to advance its own objectives. So I think there's much more of a multipolar governance scenario now with these institutions, with new members outside of the Americas, such as China, being involved with those institutions and helping to balance and force consensus.
Thank you, Jorge. Well, we have just 2 minutes left and lots of questions from the audience, which unfortunately we won't be able to address, but I think we're going to have a part 2 of this at a few times. But just a quick question for the last 2 minutes from the audience. The Latin American countries have been recently frequent visitors to the ICJ. Does this in some way represent institutional fragility, a commitment to multilateralism, or neither? Who would like to chime into that? Question? Marianna.
I feel like I'm being called. Being frequent client of the ICJ. No, I think that one of the achievements of the multilateralism in Latin America in the past was precisely Latin America's commitment to the Pacific dispute resolution, and one of those visions are precisely
the alternative to go to a jurisdictional institution instead of going or taking some kind of force measures or pressures measure against each other. So I think that could show more than a fragility of the institutional regime or regional regime. It shows another aspect that doesn't necessarily comes from that. It shows only the way in which Latin America understands that when reach the point where it cannot really resolve the issues, the controversies by negotiations or with other means, one of the options is the jurisdictional one, and that is a commitment, one of the basic principles of international law, so the peaceful settlement of disputes. So I think that goes in another direction. Maybe it could show if the origin of the controversy is, let's say, the violation of a treaty or of a norm of international law. Of course, it could show some kind of deterioration of the institutional system, but that it's what happens when every time we have a controversy in those terms, in terms of the violation of a previous obligation. But in other cases, it could be another way of looking for a solution.
Good. Well, we are right at the finishing time. All of your comments are very thought-provoking, but I do think we're going to have to have a second part of this discussion because we've touched on many different topics. But unfortunately, the time has come to end the session. So I want to thank our fantastic co-panelists for your participation and thoughts, and our audience. Thank you for being so active and for all your questions. And I'm sorry that we didn't have the time to get to all of them. But as I mentioned at the beginning, please be sure to, if you're not already formally a member of the Latin America Interest Group, do please join just by clicking on the appropriate part in the ASO website, because that ensures that you will get our messages on events and again in our upcoming business meeting later this summer. So thank you again to everyone, and we look forward to seeing you in future events of the Latin America Interest Group. Thanks.